So, who are Taiwan's Waishengren? Waishengren literally means people from other provinces, in contrast to Benshengren, or people from this province. Implicit in these terms is the notion that both groups belong to provinces of China. And this is, of course, natural, as the terms were brought into use by the Waishengren themselves. So, strictly speaking, Waishengren are not an ethnic group in themselves, as there are Cantonese Waishengren, Fujianese Waishengren, and so on, but they are generally spoken of as one ethnic group in Taiwan now. So that's what I'll do in this video too. The terms Waishengren and mainlanders, or mainland Chinese immigrants, are not entirely interchangeable. Although Taiwan has become home to immigrants from China for centuries, Waishengren refers only to those who hold or held ROC citizenship, which means in effect those who came to Taiwan during or after the Chinese Civil War, and their children. Unofficially, their children's children, that is third-generation Waishengren, may also be regarded as Waishengren, and often are by assimilation-resistant mainland families. But officially, those people whose parents were both born in Taiwan are not regarded as Waishengren. Thus, the Waishengren population has been in a slow but steady decline, from a peak of around 23% of the total population in the 1950s to somewhere around 4% at present in 2023. At the time of making this video, the youngest Waishengren, those late born of first-generation mainland immigrants who came to Taiwan as small children in the late 1940s, are already well into middle age. So, although the Waishengren now constitute only a tiny part of Taiwan's total population, their influence on the politics and culture of Taiwan since the end of World War II has been far out of proportion to their numbers. Let's take a very brief look at the history of Waishengren in Taiwan, from the end of World War II to the present. For a more in-depth look, please see my book, The Taiwan Experience. After the Second World War, Taiwan was effectively given to the Chinese nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, by the United States as a spoil of war. This was fortunate for the Chinese nationalists, as they would soon thereafter be forced to flee mainland China, facing defeat at the hands of the Chinese communists. Between 1.2 and 1.5 million mainland Chinese people arrived in Taiwan over the subsequent several years, although estimates vary and there are in fact no official figures. These people included nationalist China's elite and much of China's wealth, but also included many poor, undocumented immigrants who had thrown their lot in with the nationalist military regime. Retrocession was a term created to describe the return of Taiwan, land ceded to Japan in perpetuity in the Treaty of Shimonoseki in 1895. One of the first things the incoming government did was to remove all Japanese and native Taiwanese from positions of authority. The Japanese, mostly Okinawans, constituted around 5% of the total population, and they were forcibly repatriated. And one of the first things the new governor of Taiwan, Chen Yi, made clear in a public address was that native Taiwanese were now to be regarded as second-class citizens. The incoming government was already infamous the world over for corruption and incompetence, and it certainly lived up to its reputation after taking over the administration of Taiwan. This eventually led to the February 1947 uprising against the government, which became known as the 228 incident. Exclusion from political participation and administrative incompetence were among the factors driving mounting resentment towards the incoming mainland Chinese and its government. On February 27, 1947, in Taipei, when agents of the State Monopoly Bureau struck a Taiwanese widow suspected of selling contraband cigarettes, they were set upon by angry onlookers, and one officer then fired into the crowd, killing a bystander. A radio station was seized by protesters, and news of a revolt was broadcast to the entire island. The uprising spread, and some areas were taken over by impromptu local authorities, which set up a settlement committee to negotiate a list of 32 demands. which included demands for greater autonomy, free elections, and an end to government corruption. Without the military means to crush the uprising, Governor Chen Yi stalled for time, pretending to be interested in negotiations with the leaders of the revolt, while actually calling for military reinforcements from the mainland. The uprising was then violently put down by the nationalist military in a week-long island-wide massacre. Many of those who had taken part in the uprising fled to remote Aboriginal communities, believing themselves to be out of reach of the nationalist military there. But the nationalists found the Aboriginals, the poorest segment of Taiwanese society then as now, to be easy to bribe into turning them over for summary trials and executions. This drove a deep wedge between the Minnan-speaking majority Taiwanese and the Aboriginals on the one hand, but enabled the incoming KMT government to establish excellent relations with the indigenous peoples on the other. This would prove very useful even after democratization. Regions with substantial indigenous populations, such as Nantou, Hualien, and Taidong, would remain KMT strongholds for many decades. The Hakanese, who also tended to suffer discrimination from the mainstream Taiwanese majority, also became important allies for the incoming Waishengren, who had few friends among the mainstream Minnan-speaking population, which predominated in the major cities, where most of the killing took place. For 38 years after the massacre, the island would be placed under martial law in a period known as the White Terror, the longest period of martial law at the time anywhere in the world. The 228 incident, and particularly the ensuing massacre, became a taboo subject. In the 36 years between 1948 and 1984, the incident was mentioned only 4 times in Taiwan's local press. Thousands more local people disappeared during the White Terror years, particularly the first decade or so thereof. During this period, the arbitrary seizure of private property, which had got off to an uncertain start before the massacre, got underway in earnest. This was an era of boom for well-connected, enterprising mainlanders. Native Taiwanese of suspect political beliefs, which was most of them, were removed from positions of authority and influence, and replaced by dependable, party-loyal Waishengren. While all military officers were mainlanders to begin with, school heads and university principals needed to be replaced, as did chiefs of police and other high-ranking law enforcement officers, judges, local and regional government heads, and even publishers, as they were able to influence public opinion. By the 1960s, Taiwan had become home to a political system in which the prospects of native Taiwanese were extremely limited. The nationalist regime and the mainland immigrants who arrived in Taiwan in the years after the Chinese Civil War brought with them much of the wealth of China, as well as the cream of Chinese culture, not to mention Chinese cuisine from all over China. But they also brought a thoroughly corrupt regime that had been brought to power with considerable help from Shanghai's infamous Green Gang, which helped orchestrate the 1927 Shanghai massacre. The Green Gang had lost power even before fleeing Shanghai under the communist advance. A new criminal gang sprang up in Taiwan in the 1950s to protect the interests of Waishengren in Taiwan, the Bamboo Union. This criminal organization, which is still operative today, though only a shadow of its former self, would work closely with government and the secret police, the Taiwan Garrison Command that is, to silence criticism of the one-party state through intimidation, maimings, and murders. Today, the Bamboo Union has evolved from an exclusively Waishengren criminal gang into a Taiwan-based pro-PRC criminal gang. And while wealthy, well-connected mainland families settled in places like Taipei's northern suburbs, many far poorer immigrants serving with the ROC military settled in military-dependent villages. These were poorly constructed, mostly urban settlements, built hastily and with limited funding, no planning permission, and no land ownership rights. Most have long since been demolished, but a couple of dozen of these can still be seen in 2023, such as the showpiece 44 South Village, only a few minutes' walk from the Taipei 101. Chiang Kai-shek's son, Chiang Ching-kuo, progressively took over the reins of power in the 1960s and 70s. The United States and several dozen other countries continue to recognize the nationalist Chinese government in Taiwan as the legitimate government of China. Martial law remained in place, and the government itself remained overwhelmingly staffed by Waishengren, especially in the middle and upper levels. But Jiang realized that over the long term, a government run by Waishengren would become untenable, and he appointed a native Taiwanese, Lee Teng-hui, as vice president in 1984. He also introduced a set of economic reforms at the same time. The problem was, after Jimmy Carter switched recognition to the PRC in 1979, the ROC on Taiwan was in danger of being overshadowed and losing what support it still enjoyed to the Chinese communists, with whom Jiang had vowed never to compromise. Taipei had to be seen to truly be the capital of Free China. In September 1986, Jiang even allowed the official establishment of the opposition Democratic Progressive Party, or DPP. So, President Jiang and Vice President Li were certainly on the same page with respect to localization. However, equally certain is that the scope of Lee Teng-hui's localization ideas went far beyond what Jiang had in mind. When Jiang died in 1988, Li took over as president. Li, who grew up during the Japanese colonial rule era and spoke Japanese fluently, was generally regarded as merely a competent technocrat. But, slowly, he picked off his rivals to power and cemented his position of power with a landslide victory in Taiwan's first presidential elections in 1996. Li was deeply distrusted by many Waishengren, including former General Hao Bo-chun, leader of the KMT's conservative mainland Chinese Palace faction. Li was forthright about his youth in Japanese Taiwan and did not pretend to have been a Chinese warrior-in-waiting, and this did not go down well with many in the KMT's upper echelons of power. Under Lee Teng-hui, Taiwan enjoyed years of economic boom in the so-called economic miracle of the late 1980s and early 1990s, something which made Li even more popular than he may otherwise have been. And, in 1995, Lee Teng-hui also expressed regret at the 228 incident on behalf of the government, a move welcomed by most, but one which met with mixed reactions among the mainland Chinese community. When Chen Shui-bian was elected first as Taipei mayor in December 1994 and later as president in May 2000, he took localization further, renaming streets originally named after Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek, and setting in motion the removal of many thousands of Chiang Kai-shek statues from public places all over Taiwan and its outlying islands. Many countries have population white papers or population policy white papers, which they generally make available for anybody to download and read, usually without cost. They make their population circumstances and policies transparent, despite the risk of adverse public reaction. For example, typing population white paper into Wikipedia returns not a description of population white papers, but details of one particularly controversial population white paper published by the Singapore government in 2013. It outlined plans to allow the foreign national population of Singapore to reach close to half the total population by 2030, and it set off large-scale protests and demonstrations, something rarely seen in the city-state. Despite the controversy, the document could be downloaded by anyone who wanted to read it. At around the same time, 2013, Taiwan decided to publish its own population policy white paper, and I was the person responsible for translating it into English. This seems to have been Jiang Yi-hua's idea, the former Minister of the Interior, as that was the ministry responsible, although at the time of the white paper's publication, Jiang had already been promoted to Premier. Well, definitely a better idea than the one Jiang is best known for, support of the infamous Cross-Strait Service Trade Agreement, and the crackdown on the resulting sunflower student movement's protests against it. Anyway, nothing controversial about this population white paper. However, the subsequent population policy white paper, published a year later, was hastily taken out of the hands of the Interior Ministry and put under direct executive UN supervision. It was also given a name change. No longer was it the Population Policy White Paper, but something along the lines of the population problems faced by the Republic of China in recent years and their effective solutions. The name change was even ridiculed by the new Minister of the Interior, Lee Teng-hui, in his foreword to the White Paper, making it clear that this name change came from above. It wasn't his doing. Why did Ma do this? In my opinion, so that the document could still be made available online, yet with virtually zero possibility of any foreign experts or scholars actually finding it. As I said earlier, generally speaking, governments in democratic countries make these documents freely available for anyone who wants to download and read them. But who's going to imagine that Taiwan's Population Policy White Paper has such a ridiculously convoluted name and look that up in a search engine? So, why then didn't Ma want this population white paper to see the light of day? From my impressions, I would say there were several reasons. The childbirth incentive programs were shown to be an almost complete failure. The only sector of society where they had seen success was in the indigenous tribal regions. But probably most significantly, the Waishengren population was shown for the first time to have dropped below 5% of the total population. Additionally, there had been very little take-up of ROC citizenship among the recent mainland immigrants. In other words, they retained a status similar to foreign nationals, probably because they would have to drop PRC citizenship to get ROC citizenship. Neither state recognized dual nationality. So, let's look at these points in more detail. The first 2 points indicate that the total Han Chinese population was continuing on a downward trajectory, while the indigenous population was growing. Though these changes are very gradual, nevertheless, there were significant long-term implications. Ma, himself a first-generation mainland immigrant, was heading a very PRC-friendly government, eager to present mainland China and the rest of the world with a picture of Taiwan as a place ethnically identical with China. Within the PRC, the trend has always been towards assimilation of minorities into the Han Chinese nation, and it still is. This is seen as an inevitability and actively encouraged by the government through migration incentives, education, and even enforced sterilization of some ethnic minorities. The last thing Ma Ying-jeou's government wanted to let China and the rest of the world know was that the opposite was happening in Taiwan, and that the ethnic group which shared the most values with mainland Chinese citizens, the Waishengren, was now a minority barely any larger than the Aboriginals. But, unlike the Aboriginals, who were growing in number, the Waishengren were on a one-way road to assimilation within the Taiwanese majority. The Waishengren population are now close to being completely assimilated within the Taiwanese majority, and will be within the next 2 or 3 decades if political circumstances continue along their present trajectory. Most people who identify as Waishengren, or are identified as Waishengren, take this philosophically and care little about it. In fact, most second-generation Waishengren consider themselves to be Taiwanese as well as being Waishengren. Looking at the political dimension, it also has to be pointed out that although there has always been a tendency to support unification with China and to oppose Taiwan independence among the Waishengren population, there has never been an exact correlation between these two. For example, Zheng Nanrong, a second-generation Waishengren who set himself on fire in April 1989 rather than be arrested for insurrection, is considered a martyr for the Taiwan independence cause. And, more recently, Robert Tao, founder of Allied Microelectronics, a first-generation Waishengren, has pledged $100 million to Taiwan's national defense in the interests of safeguarding freedom, democracy and human rights. Tao describes the PRC as a crime syndicate masquerading as a nation. However, there are also those among Taiwan's Waishengren community who have found it very hard to come to terms with the loss of special privilege and equality with native Taiwanese. Case in point would be Guo Guanying, a Taiwan-born second-generation Waishengren, born in 1949, who worked at various times as a journalist for the China Times and United Daily News newspapers, and also for China TV. While later employed at Taiwan's representative office in Toronto, Guo described himself in comments online using a pseudonym as a high-class mainlander, while at the same time calling Taiwan's ethnic majority Taiwanese yokels. Comments like these, though very common in the 1980s, are rarely heard today. However, I suspect that they still strike a chord with many who don't dare to make such comments themselves. But regardless of the attitude of individual Waishengren towards assimilation, that's an inevitability. Another inevitability is that the effects of the wave of Waishengren immigration into Taiwan after the Second World War will still be felt for decades to come.